go. Okay, you should be able to see my slides now. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and also a real pleasure to talk to you about a topic that I find so exciting, and hopefully I can imbue you with some of my excitement over the next 30 or 40 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the innovative technologies which are emerging from Lancaster's Quantum Technology Centre. And I'd like to start by giving you a really brief introduction to what quantum technologies are. So I'm sure some of you on this call won't have come across quantum technologies before, because they're really quite a nascent field. So at their heart, quantum technology is one which harnesses basic principles of quantum physics to achieve something that's not possible with classical devices. And there are two primary examples which come up in the media often, or have come up in the media often in the last few years. And these are quantum computers, so on the right hand side here, and quantum communication systems down below here. Quantum computers are essentially an analog to classical computers in that they process information, but instead of processing the ones and zeros that we know and love in conventional computers, they process quantum states, which can be in a mixture of ones and zeros, that could be in probabilistic states. And this means that as computations get more and more complex, and these probabilities permeate through the system, a quantum computer can essentially tackle some of the most complicated problems we have today much more efficiently than a classical computer. And there are certain problems that we know, or we believe, a quantum computer will be able to solve that a classical computer couldn't, no matter how large a classical computer we could ever build. And that's really exciting, and that's the reason that some very big companies are heavily investing in quantum computers. And the second example of a quantum technology, this quantum communication system from Toshiba at the bottom here. These kind of systems, they use actually a negative rule in quantum mechanics to deliver provable security for communications, which is obviously incredibly valuable. So basically, in quantum mechanics, if you measure a system, if you look at a system, you can't help but change the system you're measuring. And that means that if you communicate with quantum states, you can actually detect the presence of eavesdroppers on a line. And that means you can have provably secure communications, which is really exciting. So these two technologies are both being commercially developed. Quantum communication systems are available to purchase today. There are several different companies who are making them. And quantum computers are really on the edge of being useful. They're still probably not quite useful and too difficult to operate. But it doesn't feel like it's going to be many years before quantum computers are actually doing something useful. But these really are just the very tip of a very exciting iceberg. And there are an awful lot of other quantum technologies which are going to be developed in the coming years. And I want to talk to you about how we're setting up, how we've set up a Quantum Technology Centre at Lancaster to develop these, and then some of the innovative technologies that have come out of Lancaster's Quantum Technology Centre recently. So let's dive into the Quantum Technology Centre. So obviously it's a real shame that this is a virtual meeting. It would have been nice to actually invite people to Lancaster and show you around our Quantum Technology Centre, because we're really proud of what we've been able to build here. So the Quantum Technology Centre was founded in 2013. So really ahead of the curve. Lancaster University was very forward thinking. A few years later, the UK government decided to set up a network of quantum hubs. And so the university saw that coming and acted first, which has really been to our advantage. And in the Quantum Technology Centre, we have essentially a suite of facilities for essentially designing, building, characterizing, measuring, and implementing quantum technologies. And I'll show you some of the examples of really exciting technologies which have emerged from our facilities in the next few slides. Before that, I want to show off some more of our facilities. So this is Icelav. This is a purpose-designed laboratory from the ground up, which was opened in 2017. And it contains a suite of three different laboratories, three different labs for measuring quantum devices. And as I said, this was purpose-built from the ground up. It's really exciting. It's a world-unique facility. When you're doing a measurement in Icelav, the actual instrument is sitting on a floating floor, so a large block of concrete floating on air springs. It's surrounded by a Faraday cage, so it's protected from electromagnetic noise. And then most of our experiments happen at very low temperatures. And the reason for this is we want to characterize the quantum devices we build in as protected environment as possible to isolate the signals and understand how things are working before migrating them out of the lab and making them practical and real. And some of the technologies that I'll talk to you about today started life in Icelav and have now migrated out into real world products. And that's obviously very exciting. We also have an awful lot of expertise in Lancaster in low temperature measurements. So Lancaster often has the world record for the lowest temperature ever achieved in devices, which is also the universe record because it's below the microwave background temperature in the universe. So, you know, on a day like today, I think you could probably believe Lancaster was the wettest place in the known universe, but I think most people didn't realize it's one of the coldest places in the known universe as well, which is something that's really amazing to me. And then I think another really important point about the Quantum Technology Centre, I'll just talk about very briefly before moving on, is that even though it sits in physics, so we're part of the physics department, this is a really interdisciplinary field. And the work we do involves most of the departments and disciplines in the whole of the Faculty of Science and Technology. So it's really important. The technology word means that we can't just rely on physics. We have to develop these things into practical devices. We have to understand the computer science, the material science, and interface with people like Security Lancaster and Energy Lancaster. And we also work with a wide range of different technologies which span the technology readiness level. So everything from fundamental technologies, fundamental ideas of blue skies research through to innovations which have been patented, developed into products and spun out, all the way to working with very large industrial collaborators who've got very specific problems that we help them to solve. So there's a real spectrum of different technologies that we're working on. Okay, so we only have half an hour or so today. I'm certainly not going to talk to you about everything that's going on in the Quantum Technology Centre, but I do want to spend some time to kind of go into a little bit more detail about some of the innovations which we've developed, some of the innovative technologies we've developed in the Quantum Technology Centre over the last few years, and how they're being commercialized and how they're hopefully going to change the world. And I'm going to concentrate on some of my research, some of my innovations, because obviously they're personal to me and it's easier for me to talk about those. My research is in the field of quantum security, so that's developing quantum technologies to solve problems in cybersecurity. And most of my work can be divided into one of these three areas. So quantum communication systems that I mentioned earlier, and I won't go into more detail about those today. Something called a physical and clonable function, which has some really exciting applications in the field of anti-counterfeiting and authentication. I'll show you where we're using those and where they're actually going to be practically applied. And also talk briefly about random number generation. I think random numbers, most people don't understand just how important random numbers are and how there's a lack of randomness in most of existing random number generators. And so I want to talk to you about how we're solving that problem and how it's going to increase security and hopefully improve the world as well. And I should say, I co-founded a spin-out company, Quantum Base, quite a few years ago now. So all this technology is being spun out through this company alongside the university, and Quantum Base are actually based at the university. Okay. So maybe just 10 seconds telling you a little bit about me personally and who I am. So obviously, I'm a professor at Lancaster University, but I think I'm really unusual as academics or indeed physicists go in. I'm very problem driven. I really like the idea of tackling problems and applying science to solve it, to find solutions to those problems, and hopefully seeing those through to change the world. And so the three kind of areas I want to talk to you about, the three innovations I'm going to talk to you about, are all problem driven, and I'll introduce them in terms of the problems they're solving. And the first of those problems is the problem of counterfeiting. And I think most people, when they think about counterfeiting, they maybe don't realize how big a problem counterfeiting actually is. You might have a picture like this one on the left-hand side with a sports jersey on it, for example. and you think, well, counterfeiting is not that bad. It means that some people can get sports jerseys for a little bit less than the genuine article, but you don't necessarily think about where that money goes and the harm it has on people who actually genuinely make these articles. But actually, counterfeiting is far more ubiquitous and invasive. And it's in almost every sector and in almost every industry, and it's one of the largest problems commercially in the world today. An example that might surprise you is the pharmaceutical industry has the biggest problem with counterfeiting. Counterfeit drugs cost the pharmaceutical industry hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and they actually kill people. If you're producing a counterfeit drug, there's no need to put an active ingredient in, there's no need to go through regulations and things like this. And so people taking counterfeit drugs often aren't getting the treatment they deserve or expect, and so therefore die from these diseases that they're trying to treat. So this is a really big problem. And another example that's quite eye-opening is in the field of automotive or aerospace. You might be driving a car that has counterfeit brake pads on and not know. And of course, those brake pads are not going to perform like the genuine article. So this is a really big problem that has very big implications for society. So how can we solve this problem? Well, I like to think outside the box and think, what would an ideal solution be like? And an ideal solution would be able to essentially implant a fingerprint or read some unique information from every object we buy, and then check its provenance against the database from the manufacturer to say that this item is genuine and when it was manufactured and that it's been handled correctly and that it's not out of date, for example, as well. So we'd like to be able to read a fingerprint from almost everything we buy. But how can we do this? Well, it's clear that existing anti-counterfeiting technologies are failing. So the most popular anti-counterfeiting technologies that we all know and are used to seeing are things like holograms, RFID tags, and conventional taggants. And these are all essentially too easy to clone. They're not individual, and they can't be used to label nearly as many items as we would really like them to. So they're really part of the problem. They're not actually a solution. If we look at things like solutions like holograms, the problem is that there's symmetry between how easy it is to make a hologram and how easy it is to clone a hologram. So if you look at a hologram under a microscope, for example, it's just a series of ridges in a metal film. If you copy those ridges, you can make a clone of that hologram. So it's just as easy for the counterfeiters to copy a hologram as it is the original manufacturer to make one. So it's not a compelling anti-counterfeiting solution, but it is used ubiquitously, and it's used a lot because it's very, very easy for somebody to check. The average consumer likes to see a hologram because they can actually visually check that the hologram's there. On the other end of the scale, we have very convoluted and much more advanced anti-counterfeiting technologies, which are baked into things like banknotes. But the vast majority of people who handle these banknotes don't know how to check them. You might need some special instrumentation to read some micron scale pattern or some more advanced anti-counterfeiting technology that's been built into these items. So in the anti-counterfeiting space, you kind of have this paradox that solutions are either robust and difficult to check, so therefore very few people actually check them, or like holograms, the solutions are very easy to check, but not very secure. And that's why counterfeiting as a problem nationally and internationally is only getting worse, and it's only got worse over the last few decades. Now, again, let's think outside the box and what's an ideal solution to this problem? Well, if we really could implant a fingerprint in everything, we should look at the atomic scale, because everything's unique at the atomic scale. There's no way currently for us to manufacture two devices which are atomically identical, not two microscopic devices. And indeed, even with the best manufacturing technologies we have at the moment, it's not even possible to manufacture two very small pieces of a semiconductor which are identical. These are some beautiful images, some really stunning images taken in a facility like Icelav. These were pre-Icelav. But these show some nanostructures which we created here at Lancaster. And these lines that you can see running across the image, they're single planes of atoms, and these dots are single atoms. So this is atomic level imagery of nanostructures which were created here. And each one of these 4 nanostructures was created at the same time. And you can see they're all actually wildly different in terms of the formation of the atoms around the nanostructure. And the reason for that, of course, is that when you're building something that has tens of thousands of atoms in, the chance that all the atoms will go in exactly the same place is vanishingly small. In fact, it's basically 0. So we can't make anything small that's identical, and we certainly can't make anything large that's identical. So if we had a way to read a fingerprint from atomic level information, then we could find a holy grail solution to this anti-counterfeiting technology. That's what we've done here at Lancaster, which I'm really proud of, and now I'll explain how that works. And actually the explanation starts with the development of quantum materials, which really happened around 2 decades ago now. So 2004, Andrei Guy and Icelav in Manchester, they discovered graphene, which is a so-called quantum material. So it's a single plane of carbon atoms in a hexagonal lattice, so it looks a bit like a honeycomb. And because of the way the electrons are forced to travel through a single plane of atoms, these materials have really crazy properties, some really exciting properties. And people have invested a huge amount of effort and resource since then to try and harness these properties in real-world devices. Both Andrei Guy and Icelav won the Nobel Prize in 2010 for their discovery. It's considered to be that important. But the problem is, it's incredibly difficult, or essentially impossible, to make 2 flakes of graphene which are identical at the atomic level. As I showed you on the previous slide, when we make nanostructures, there are natural imperfections, and whenever you have tens of thousands of atoms, the chance of all of them being in the same place in 2 different nanostructures is vanishingly small. This is actually some exfoliated graphene, which was made in the same way as the Nobel Prize winners actually made their graphene back in 2004. This is a cartoon image of essentially the problem. If your electrons are confined and they will only travel in the plane of an atom, in this single plane of atoms, then they experience all the imperfections that are in the material. And it means that no 2 flakes of graphene have exactly the same properties. So our solution basically put these 2 problems, or these 2 pieces of the puzzle together. So we said, well, we need a better anti-counterfeiting solution, and we know it's incredibly difficult to make nanomaterials which behave consistently, even at the macroscopic level, even at the level which can be read by the human eye or by a mobile phone. So can we use nanomaterials to label products and then derive fingerprints from these imperfections and use them to verify their authenticity? And that was basically the birth of the invention of QID, of our quantum identity tag, and which Quantum Base has been developing over the last few years. And I'll show you how far we've got in that development. So firstly, let me show you what this really looks like. So this is a flake of a 2-dimensional material. It's been excited optically, so the flash from a mobile phone has been used to excite it. And then in 3 different locations, we're looking at the color of light which is being emitted by this flake. And you can see the color is subtly different in these 3 different locations, and actually the bandwidth of emission, which we don't need to talk about, it's again a little bit complicated, is also different. So what we need to do is we need to mass manufacture these materials and then incorporate them into a surface coating in the tag and develop a method to read fingerprints from them using a mobile phone. And that's exactly what we've done. So firstly, the mass manufacture of these materials is actually really very facile. So the Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery, and that was using just sellotape. So you take a block of graphite and you can exfoliate single flakes of graphene just using a piece of sellotape. It's amazing that you can get a Nobel Prize for an experiment involving sellotape. I wish I'd been so forward thinking. But we can actually manufacture large quantities of graphene in a method that's really not much less crude, and that's just using a blender. So you can take a blender, it has to be a slightly more advanced blender than the typical home blender that's pictured here, but you put a solvent in, so something like water, you turn on the blades of the blender and it makes a vortex inside the blender, and you put graphite in, and if you get the conditions correct, the shear force, so the difference in force at the top of the vortex and the bottom of the vortex, will just rip single planes of atoms off the graphite block, and you'll be left with an ink. And so you can make very large quantities of graphene inks like this for very little money, and then you can print them using conventional printing technologies to make QID tags. So when we do this, when we make a tag and we read it with a mobile phone, we get a very complicated pattern like this. This is actually selecting a single energy of emission, so it's using a filter. But we've recently, over the last couple of years, it's not that recent, I suppose, developed a technology to do this without any additional filters. So we've developed a smartphone application, which to the end user just looks like you're taking a photograph of a tag. There's really nothing complicated about it. Its inner workings are a little bit more complicated. So when it's taking a reading of one of these tags, it actually fires the flash on the mobile phone, and it takes a series of images at different flash intensities. And as well as capturing the unique pattern, so the unique pattern from the glow of these materials, it also measures a quantum property of the material. So it verifies that a quantum system generated that tag. And that's really important because it means you can't clone or fool our system by just showing it a photocopy of an expected response of the tag. So I'm showing you two different implementations here. So we're working with a few different printing partners now. The one on the left is a hologram company, and the quantum material is embedded in a clear lacquer on the surface of the hologram. On the right here, this is a solution that was developed for a very large smartphone manufacturer, and the solution is integrated into a QR code. So there's a patch of the quantum material in the center of a QR code, and the QR code surrounds it. So the concept here is that this can be incorporated on any product that has a QR code on it in the near future. And we've recently licensed this technology, and it should be hopefully in the market next year, in the first half of next year. So we've also looked at solving printing challenges. I think I probably skipped over that very quickly in the previous slide. But these materials are really quite easy to work with, certainly if you involve chemists and they modify the materials in ways that make them compatible with standard inks. And we've done an awful lot of trials with different printing technologies, and we've solved a lot of mass manufacturing issues. In terms of how we actually register these tags, we use the existing machine vision system in a factory to measure the identity from each tag as it's made, entered into a database. And then when that tag is, when a product is labeled with one of those tags, it's let out into the wild. And then anybody with a smartphone will be able to verify its identity and its provenance from the signature, which is trapped within that QID tag. This is an example of a use case in the pharmaceutical industry. I mentioned the pharmaceutical industry earlier. I think the pharma use case here is an incredibly important one, because obviously counterfeiting in pharmaceuticals costs lives. Initially, we can put the QID tag, for example, on a foil or on the actual outer label. But many of these materials are food safe, and we're looking at ways to actually incorporate these materials into clear coatings on pills. So for example, into the glucose coating, the sugar coating on the outside of a pill, so that you'll be able to identify single pills as you take them. And obviously that has additional benefits. So you can make sure your pill isn't counterfeit, but you can also make sure that it's in date, that you're taking it at the right time, that it's not incompatible with other medication you're taking. So there are lots of additional benefits from tracking consumption of things like pharmaceuticals in this way. So it's really a very exciting development. So just I guess in terms of where we are commercially here, so we're mass manufacturing these tags now, and they're basically ready for market, and we have a working smartphone app doing that reading. So as I said earlier, we're expecting products in the market very early next year, which is very, very exciting. I love the idea that something that we invented here, something that we patented here, this is world unique technology, is going to be in hopefully a very large number of people's hands in the very near future. Okay, so I'm going to talk, I'm just going to change tack a little bit and talk about another innovation next, and I'll cover questions at the end if that's okay. And the second technology that I'd like to talk about, which we've developed here at Lancaster, is actually very similar to the first. So it's again around this concept of fingerprinting or producing a unique identity from nanostructures. But this time we want to read them electronically, and we want to use them to identify small electronic devices. And the problem that we're solving here is this communication problem. So in the current day, we have tens of billions of connected devices, and the vast majority of these are not computers. They're not desktop computers or laptops or iPads as we know them. They're Internet of Things devices, which unfortunately, manufacturers design Internet of Things devices to be cheap and to do a very specific job, but very rarely do they consider security implications when they're actually designing these systems. And so, we're seeing more and more very large, very costly security breaches where, the security breach is linked to the poor implementation of security standards and the lack of resources in Internet of Things devices. So the concept is to develop very simple, light, cheap quantum technologies which can do an awful lot better for fewer resources to protect small embedded electronic devices like Internet of Things devices. And one way to do this is to extract identities from the fundamental makeup of the chips, the integrated circuits inside of these devices, rather than try to store very long, complex passwords or secrets inside them to identify them and for secure communication. So if you think when you're unlocking a smartphone, for example, there are two different ways you can do that typically these days. You can either remember a password, or you can use biometric information, so physical information about yourself to prove who you are. And we see a transition in digital electronics from that memory of passwords, from using expensive, easy to clone keys stored in memory, to extracting identities from the actual physical makeup of these devices. And this isn't a field that's new. It's not a field that we invented here at Lancaster. There's a class of device called a physical and clonable function, which is used in some electronic devices currently. But the problem is that existing physical and clonable functions are based on macroscopic effects. So they might identify a SIM card based on the resistance between two contact pads on that SIM card. And the problem is that that's just too easy to clone. So a physical and clonable function is unfortunately clonable, which obviously clashes and jives with its name a little bit. And so what we did, which was the innovative side of things, was to take this down to the quantum level and say, can we identify electronic devices at the atomic scale and thus make them as difficult as they ever will be to produce clones of, to copy their identities? And I guess in some landmark work in 2015, we showed how to do this scientifically, and I won't go through the science here, but we're using a structure called a quantum well, and we're using its properties to basically magnify imperfections in the well to read read a fingerprint from them and then use that for authentication. And since then, we've been developing this commercially and in terms of an application. So how can we actually use this to secure real Internet of Things devices? And the first kind of really important innovation there was to use networks of these structures. So by using as few as a 10 by 10 array, so 100 devices in total, we can get a very large amount of unique information from a structure. We can get gigabits of information. And 100 diodes in an Internet of Things devices is nothing. A typical Internet of Things device might have millions of transistors in it. So this is a lot cheaper and easier and faster and more secure than paying for some large memory element to store the same amount of information in an Internet of Things device. And then critically, if we make this array a little bit larger, so we go to 20 by 20, for example, we can have more permutations than you could possibly read in the age of the universe. So you can have more information stored, more unique information stored in a cheap Internet of Things device than you could possibly ever read using the laws of physics. So using the time it takes, the minimum time it takes to measure one response times by the total number of responses the system can produce. And that allows us to implement ways to communicate provably securely with these devices. And that's obviously a very exciting development. And currently, as quantum-based as a commercial development, we've produced prototypes on USB sticks. So these could be used to retrofit existing very high security systems with better security, or security critical systems. And we're currently in the stages of implementing this in very simple mass manufacturable silicon manufacturing, so that we can put these inside processors and inside integrated circuits. And the idea is to bring this to Internet of Things devices. So it's just naturally integrated into the silicon. It actually reduces the cost, increases the speed, and increases the security. And we see a really wide range of applications. And another really important application here is in the blockchain space. So if you think about what a blockchain is essentially a series of blocks of information where every next block is convoluted with information from the previous blocks in the chain. So the security of the blockchain itself, even if you had something like a quantum computer attacking it, is quite good and quite robust. But where blockchains fall down is where they're rooted in the real world. So when you actually try and tie a transaction to something or to somebody, or you have to use an identity to prove that a transaction is valid. And so we see a really nice application of our technology is in securing that last endpoint or the start point of blockchain transactions. And that's something that we're actively working on with some partners at Quantum Base. Okay, so I realize this is a little bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm just going to spend the last 5 minutes talking about one more innovation. I'm sorry, maybe I should have refined this and only talked about one or two things. But it's really difficult not to talk about all my babies when I'm giving a talk like this. And the third problem then that I'll talk about is the importance of random numbers, and then a product which Quantum Base are developing, which will hopefully address existing issues with random numbers. So firstly, why are random numbers important? Well, I think that they're important in almost every aspect of our lives, and there's all sorts of things which vary from trivial all the way to things which are mission critical. So firstly, let's pick something obvious, like the number on the front of your credit card. If the number on the front of your credit card is predictable, and the CCV number on the back is predictable, then people can steal money from your account. So banks obviously have a vested interest in making sure that their numbers they generate are as random as possible. We have games that get played, like the lotteries, which obviously involve random numbers. We have Internet of Things devices, which need to communicate securely, so they need to generate session keys and things like this, and they can do that obviously from physical and clonable functions, from QIDs that I talked about earlier, but they still need to add some randomness for the security of the communications there. We have other much less obvious things like charging vehicles. So if we move to a future where everybody has an electric car that's plugged in to a socket, it's really important they don't all try to charge at the same time. Otherwise, we get this Coronation Street effect where everybody puts their kettle on a break in Coronation Street, and the grid suddenly goes crazy as the load increases by 300%. And of course, the scale of the problem is much worse when you have a high-power device like a smart car. And then maybe just one last example here. We might have something like sharing videos on YouTube, where you only want to share it with your family, and you have a unique ID in the URL. It's really important that people can't guess what they are and watch each other's videos when you want to keep it private. So there's a huge number of uses for random numbers. And I think it's quite surprising, firstly, that humans are really rubbish at doing anything random. So if you ask an audience, I could probably have done this live, to pick numbers between 1 and 10, almost everybody will pick 7. So the human brain seems to think that 7 is a more random number between 1 and 10 than any of the other numbers. In this particular example, a quarter of people picked 7. And it depends how you ask the question, but as many as half of the audience will pick 7 typically. It's quite a nice little party game. And you might think, well, humans are bad, but actually computers are worse in many ways. So computers are deterministic systems. If you tell them to do the same thing twice, they'll give you the same answer twice, or at least they should. That's part of the point of the computer. So how do we get them to do anything random at all? And the truth is that the processes we use to generate randomness in computers are really not very good at all, typically. And some examples of highlights of really interesting things that have happened because computers are not very random. There was a woman who won the lottery in the US 4 times because actually she was a professor of statistics, and she worked out a pattern in the serial number printed on the front of a scratch card, so she could predict which scratch cards were going to win. She won a lot of money and retired, which is great. Bitcoin wallet addresses, for example, they need to be random, and there was a big flaw in Java on Android phones a few years ago that meant they really weren't very random at all, and so it's quite easy to steal money from certain Bitcoin wallets. ID cards in Estonia, they were all essentially broken because of a flaw in random number generators, which were handling their encryption, and that was just a couple of years ago. And the examples go on and on and on. So random numbers are incredibly important for security. And the problem is only getting worse as computers get more and more powerful. The ability to be able to predict the output of these poor random number generators, for example, in our mobile phones, is just getting easier and easier. So of course, I'm going to tell you quantum technology has a solution to this problem, and it actually is really fundamental to quantum technology. It's one of the biggest differences between a quantum system and a classical system. And in classical mechanics and classical physics, if you're given all the information about a system, you can always necessarily predict how it's going to behave in the future. So if I toss a coin and I know everything there is to know about the coin, about the environment, how that coin was tossed, I can predict how that coin will land in classical physics. But in quantum physics, that's not true. In quantum physics, there's no way of knowing how a system will evolve. You can only say with certain probabilities what will happen. And that's actually quite uncomfortable for many scientists, and it's the reason why Einstein didn't like quantum physics, for example. But companies have exploited this, and ID Quantique were probably first to market, and they generated they've developed a quantum random number generator they've been selling for years now. And the way this works is basically you have a beam splitter, so a shiny piece of glass, and you shine light on that glass. And some of the light goes through the glass and some of the light bounces off the glass. And quantum mechanics says that happens randomly. There's a 50-50 chance that each of those photons, each particle of light will either go through the glass or bounce off the glass. And if you look which way the photons go, either transmitting or reflecting, you can generate a series of ones and zeros, and you can make a really nice sorts of random numbers. And so they packaged this up and they've sold it as a product. And the problem with it is, of course, that it's very bulky and slow, and it experiences classical noise, and it's quite expensive, but it has found some applications, but it's certainly not found mass market applications. It has recently been miniaturized, and there is a mobile phone you can buy with this technology in, but it's very expensive, and I would say it's not especially reliable. And what we've done here at Lancaster is we've invented an electronic analog to this. So we do basically the same effects, but with electrons going through a diode. And it's just a single diode which can be incorporated again, actually into the integrated circuit inside mobile phones. So it's really small, it's light, and it's incredibly fast. And we've produced, again, the first prototypes using just a simple USB stick, which we are currently in the process of commercially developing. And so we have a really simple, cheap, and easy solution to this problem of randomness. Okay, so I think I'm more or less at the end of my main section, and I'm going to move into talks into questions very quick soon. But I just wanted to leave you with this slide here, which has a link to 3 different videos we produced that kind of go into more detail about some of these technologies and about some of the other things we're doing in the Quantum Technology Centre. So they're all tinyurl.com, and then there's Lancaster Innovation Festival, LIF 2020A, 2020B, and 2020C. So hopefully they're all easy for you to put into your web browsers and to memorize. Okay, so I think I'm going to jump into questions now. I'll start with Matt's question. What sort of companies could partner on such projects, and how can we capture the benefits economically to the local area? That's a really good question. I think so. Firstly, we try to work with as big a range of companies as possible. So we deal with everything from really large international corporations who've got problems and they might want to have a local base here and solve the problems locally here. Or we can spin out companies, and we've even worked with some very small local companies that don't necessarily have any background in quantum technologies. There might be a printing company that have a problem with a particular, with a particular ink or something like this, and it's actually related to something very complicated in the chemistry, which links to quantum physics in some way. It's really difficult to go into details without breaking any NDAs. So I guess the answer to the question is we can work with almost any company. And how do we capture the value locally? Well, I think the answer is bespoke. So it really depends on the company, and it was really important that we do that, of course. But if we can keep it local, that's great. So if we can spin it out and actually have the base of the company here, and companies trading from here, that's fantastic. Of course, we can license IP. So as a university, we have a team of people who are dedicated to managing IP, and we have an awful lot of IP that comes out of the Quantum Technology Centre. And obviously, then there's a link to the university, there's a link to the region, and there's a method to actually put some of the revenues from licensing that IP back into the local community, which is great. Okay, I hope I've answered that question. Now I'll go to Mark Beresford's question. How big can quantum be to the economy in the UK? What's the potential economical impact? Particularly for job creation. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good question. I think the UK is, well, so first of all, how big can it be? I see the quantum technology revolution being a revolution. I think it will have a very similar impact to the digital revolution and also to the industrial revolution before it. So it has the potential to completely change the world. I really believe that, and it's why I have a big smile on my face in the morning when I get out of bed and I get to work on these kind of devices. In terms of capturing that for the UK, I think there's a great deal of potential. I think the UK is ahead of the curve in certain areas in quantum technologies, and that's fantastic. It means we have momentum that other countries would have to catch up to. I think it's also nice because a lot of the manufacturing problems have already been solved, and if we're working with semiconductor devices, for example, it's leveraging IP that's developed in the UK and the UK's academic and intellectual background, and that allows the UK to really win where it does best. I think you look at very successful companies such as ARM, and obviously that's been sold now. But the way in which that's influenced the world is really fantastic, and it's something that I think we should take a lesson from. I think the UK should be developing more ARM-like companies, and it certainly is in the quantum space. There are lots of companies that are UK-based that are dealing with some of the largest companies in the world who are investing in quantum, and it's all around UK-generated IP, ideas, designs, and prototypes rather than the mass manufacturing side of things. And I think the UK can really benefit very well by holding on to the IP and holding on to those developments. And I think this really is an iceberg, and I think this is the tip of an iceberg, and quantum technologies is obviously the rest of that iceberg. And I think one thing that's really nice about that is it means there's an awful lot of opportunities. There's not an awful lot where two different partners are working on exactly the same thing around the world, racing to achieve exactly the same thing, other than the obvious example of quantum computers, for example. And so that means the UK can really find very valuable niches, which it will develop, which other countries won't. And so I think the UK can stay ahead of countries like the US and China in those areas. And obviously, things like patents and IP do play a role in that. And even, I think when IP and China are mentioned in the same sentence, a lot of people don't believe or don't think that China play very fairly in the IP space. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair reflection. I think China's got an awful lot better in that in recent years. So yeah, I hope I've answered that question. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I think I've finished. I don't really know. Dan, are you there?
Hi, Rob. Yes, I'm here. And if you want to just stop the share, then that'd be great.
I have done.
Smash him. Well, thank you for that, Rob. It was just absolutely incredible work that you've showcased there, and personally fascinated by all the work there and all the developments that you're getting on, and just fantastic that you've been able to share that with us as part of this event. So I really appreciate your time on that. And I'm just checking to see if there's nothing more coming. Well, I think it was just a thank you from people there. So thanks, Rob, and thank you to everybody who's kind of tuned in for this session. We've put the links there that you've shared into the chat, and there will go into a central document as well that we're using to collate all this information. And of course, the session has been recorded, so it will go onto our YouTube channel.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Dan. It was a real pleasure. I'm sorry if I put too much detail in. It's so tempting to talk about everything we're doing. I think Ian's just asked for contact details. That's fine. Yeah, I'll just put my email address in the thread if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Right. This is my Lancaster email address, which is probably the best one to find me on. Okay, well, thanks ever so much, everybody. It was a real pleasure.
Great. We'll wrap up there. Thanks very much, Rob. If you can just hold on to the line for a few moments, that'd be great.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.